So, November 23, variant 23, the question says explain how import tariffs, okay, how import tariffs might correct an imbalance. Okay, it's open-ended. They've just mentioned imbalance, not a surplus, not a deficit in the current account of the balance of payment, and consider whether these tariffs are the best way of correcting such an imbalance. This is one of the policies related question. And, usually a 12 marker में आता है, but this is the only 8 marker on current account that we have policy correction के अंदर. Okay. But there are all sorts of questions that comes on this. Yeah. So what do we do? How do we explain? First, उसने कहा explain how import tariffs might correct an imbalance on the current account. I see a lot of definitions that I think we should explain over here. सबसे पहले तो I think we should define what an import tariff is. Okay. According to Bamford, import tariff is obviously part of a protectionist policy. तो हम import tariff को explain करेंगे as अगर बहुत ही brief करना है तो we could say that it's a tax imposed on imported goods and services. What else does it do? I think if you want, you can briefly suggest that it uh, raises the price of imported goods. Okay. And increases the competitiveness of domestic goods. I think that would be काफी reasonable explanation है. Just for definition purposes, मेरे ख्याल में तो आपको mark मिल जाना चाहिए on the very first part that it's a tax imposed on imported goods and services. बाकी तो सब added information है. फिर उसके बाद what else can we define? I think we should define what does it mean to have an imbalance. It can be either side. It can be a surplus or a deficit. Current account का imbalance समझा रहे हैं. I think what we need to do also, बहुत briefly सा आप बता सकते हो कि what current account has, because मैं surplus और deficit किस तरह से समझाऊं without mentions of the four things. So I think we should mention that a current account on the balance of payment has four accounts, which includes um, trade in goods, trade in service, primary incomes, and secondary incomes. Inflows are credited as positive entry. I think that would be a fair discussion. And outflows of money are debited as negative entry. I think इसके बाद अगर मैं डेफिसिट और सरप्लस को समझाने जाऊं तो I think that will be much more clearer now. क्योंकि imbalance लिखा है तो imbalance को define current account surplus, where I think just to mention that if the inflows are greater than outflows, that's what a surplus is. And अगर हम deficit को समझाने जाएं तो उसमें हम कह सकते हैं that the inflows are lesser than outflows. Is it answering the first part? Explain how import tariffs are might correct an imbalance on the current account. तो आई हैव अ प्रॉब्लम ओवर हियर क्योंकि अभी तक तो मैंने सिर्फ डिफाइन ही किया है एंड आई हैवंट रियली आंसर्ड द फर्स्ट पार्ट सो आई नॉलेज एंड अंडरस्टैंडिंग में ऐसी सिचुएशन के अंदर दिस इज वेयर इट्स पुटिंग मी इन अ वियर्ड प्लेस कि अब ये मैंने एक्सप्लेन तो किया ही नहीं है कि टैरिफ्स किस तरीके से इंपोर्ट बैलेंस को ठीक कर सकता है फॉर 3 मार्क्स आई थॉट ये 3 मार्क्स होने चाहिए बेस्ड ऑन द मार्किंग स्कीम वही होगा um, so let's try an answer. Let's do a whole explanation of how it may succeed and how it may not succeed. And then क्योंकि लिखा हुआ है and consider whether these tariffs are the best way of correcting an imbalance. Um, तो फिर उसमें alternative दे देंगे. सही? So let's do this. फिर आगे let's continue. How can tariffs help us correct the imbalance? तो हम इसको ऐसे लिखेंगे that I'm surprised इन्होंने डायग्राम नहीं मांगा but sure tariffs will increase the price of imported goods and reduce the demand for imported goods, leading to reduction in import expenditure. This will increase, oh, sorry, this will decrease the outflow and improve the net exports, thereby improving the trade balance. Right, that's what I'm thinking. यहाँ पे डायग्राम बना सकते हो, डायग्राम बना के शो कर दो जैसे भी, and I think you should get a mark. Diagram will not be graded, but at least you'll get something out of it. अच्छा, अब whether this will happen or not is the evaluation वाला part. तो मेरे ख्याल के अंदर इसके अंदर अगर हम evaluation लिखने जाएं या फिर एनालिसिस में आई वुड हैव अस्यूम्ड कि एनालिसिस के अंदर द डिस्कशन ऑफ पीईडी ऑफ एक्सपोर्ट्स एंड इंपोर्ट्स अभी तो हम क्या कर रहे हैं इंपोर्ट टैरिफ लगा रहे हैं तो इंपोर्ट के ऊपर डिस्कशन जाएगा ना सो अ डिस्कशन दैट इफ पीईडी फॉर इंपोर्ट्स इज ग्रेटर देन 1 फिर क्या होगा तो टैरिफ विल कॉज द प्राइस ऑफ इंपोर्ट्स टू राइज because the goods imports is elastic, that means the percentage change in imports will be bigger than the percentage change in the price of imports. So if import price goes up, we know that the quantity demand for imports will fall, but much larger fall will happen. And therefore, the import expenditure is going to fall significantly. So our conclusion is that if PED for imports is greater than 1, then import tariff will improve current account. However, अगर PED for imports is less than 1, then when the price of import rises, the quantity of import fall will be much lesser and your import expenditure will be higher. And as a result, right? So if PED for imports is less than 1, then import tariff will worsen the current account. I think this is how you go about it. Alternative policy, I think because it says whether these tariffs are the best way of correcting an imbalance, so we've said how it will and how it will not. Marks तो पूरे हो जाने चाहिए. Let me just show you this for a second and then tell you what problems I'm facing in this. This is what they're saying for this particular question. Okay? They're asking us कि पहले जो है आप define करें import tariffs को. We did that. Then they're telling us to what is measured by current account of the balance of payment, the four accounts plus minus सारी वो बातें. Did we mention plus को surplus? अच्छा वो नीचे आ गया था. I think नीचे मैंने ये नहीं mention किया था. I just did inflows and outflows, but you can even add to that if you have a positive value, inflow is greater than outflow, so that would be considered as a surplus. But if inflows are less and outflows are more, so then you can consider it as a deficit. So I think that would be a fair to mention also. फिर उसके बाद they're saying over here for an analysis of how import tariffs will affect the prices of imports, how it will, that's a weird thing to say. But uski explanation, I think that is all you have to do, the explanation of it, import tariffs, but how this may affect when the price goes up, obviously the consumption falls, and how this may correct the imbalance. Note a diagram may be useful but cannot be expected. Final effect is uncertain. Example, as a result of PED for imports, other policies can be used. Okay, so that's where they're suggesting it. इसके बारे में. So whether trading competitors retaliate. Basically, जब हम कहते हैं ना कि tariff से imports reduce हो जाएंगे तो current account may improve, but please keep in mind, I haven't mentioned it over here, but tariff के लगाने से when other countries retaliate, that may end up hurting your exports. तो जहां हम एक बात करते हैं that price of import बढ़ने की वजह से imports की quantity गिर जाएंगी and import expenditure कम हो जाएगा. On the other end, अगर retaliation भी हो जाती है और reasonable retaliation हो जाती है तो we can expect कि हमारा exports भी गिर जाएगा. So that will sort of like have a net effect and it's just going to worsen our current account. तो ये उस पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से आई थिंक इन्होंने डिस्कशन की है. इट्स अ फेयर डिस्कशन टू बी मेड. आई थिंक अच्छा है, कर सकते हैं, इसके ऊपर पूरा डिस्कशन बन सकता है. ऑलराइट, अनदर क्वेश्चन दैट दे हैव ऑन दिस, इसमें थोड़ा सा मुझे कुछ चीजों की एक्सप्लेनेशन देनी होगी. इट इज पार्ट बी ऑफ द सेम क्वेश्चन, November 23 के अंदर, वेरिएंट 23. And it says a country has a persistent deficit on the current account of its balance of payment. Okay. Assess the likely consequence for the domestic and external economy of this country. Okay. Question like this. इस तरह के क्वेश्चंस पास्ट में इन्फ्लेशन के रिलेटेड आ गए जहां उन्होंने आपको एक मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक ऑब्जेक्टिव इन्फ्लेशन की बात की है एंड देन देर सेइंग कि बताओ इसके डोमेस्टिक और एक्सटर्नल इफेक्ट्स ओके बट दिस वन इज अबाउट द करंट अकाउंट वी हैव अ persistent deficit okay according to Bamford when we go into Bamford and we ask कि भाई करंट अकाउंट के अंदर जब सरप्लस आता है और डेफिसिट आता है So, what could be the causes behind deficit? The technical way of looking at it is that the outflows are greater than the inflows, right? If I was to mention a few things here, जब हम deficit की बात करते हैं, तो we know that the outflows are greater than the inflows. But remember, outflows or inflows, trade in goods, trade in service, primary income, secondary income. In चारों का collection, okay? But let's not forget this word persistent, which means that you have a continuous deficit happening. You have a continuous outflow of money. इसको हम कभी कभार नैरो डाउन करके सिंपलिस्टिक टर्म्स में ऐसे बोल देते हैं कि हमारे इंपोर्ट्स ज्यादा हैं और एक्सपोर्ट्स कम है विद द assumption that usually countries का export and import is the heavy value and that's why एक्सपोर्ट इंपोर्ट के नंबर्स हैव अ बिग इन्फ्लुएंस ऑन द करंट अकाउंट जब हम बैंफर्ड से पूछते हैं कि भाई बैंफर्ड के अंदर ये डेफिसिट के कॉजेज तो दे आर नॉट टेलिंग अस टेक्निकली कि इंपोर्ट एक्सपोर्ट और प्राइमरी सेकेंडरी में इनफ्लोज एंड आउटफ्लोज इट टॉक्स इन टर्म्स ऑफ कि इफ यू हैव अ डेफिसिट देयर आर थ्री रीजंस बिहाइंड द डेफिसिट ओके रीजन नंबर वन थोड़ा सा मैं क्वेश्चन से हट के अभी बात कर रहा हूं इज दैट a country, whichever country is experiencing a deficit, is going through a growing domestic economy. And I'm sure इसकी मार्किंग स्कीम भी एक दो मिनट में देख लेंगे, but I'm sure उसके अंदर भी यही रीजन होंगे. Because, you know, growing domestic economy. Now, how does this explain? Why do we have a deficit because of this? When a country's economy is growing, chances are that number one, people are making good incomes from selling their goods and services. It's a growing economy. तो जब लोगों की इनकम्स राइज हो रही होती हैं तो उस राइजिंग इनकम की वजह से दे टेंड टू import a lot also. Another reason is if the economy is growing, your imports are generally up because of raw material and things like that. You're importing raw materials, you're importing machineries and things like that. ठीक है, and at the same time, because your economy is growing, your domestic demand is much more higher, so you don't have much products to sell abroad, resulting in exports falling down. ये एक growing economy की situation होती है. तो imports are high, exports are not really growing. Okay? फिर दूसरा reason they suggest is that there may be, for a deficit, there may be declining economic activity of trading partners. Yani, those countries which were buying your goods and services, they don't have the capacity to buy. They're in a recession, they may be in a slowdown. And as a result, our exports are going down because of that. ठीक है तो ये सेकंड रीजन सजेस्ट किया है इन्होंने बैनफर्ड की बुक के अंदर Third reason they're suggesting is that the country is actually going through certain structural problems. I think we in Pakistan can resonate with that. ये असल में प्रॉब्लम क्या है, एंड दिस इज द वर्स्ट वन, दिस इज द problematic one. The first two are not such a problematic one. The third one is the real problem for any economy. And this is like one of those long run concerns, because what is happening is, because we have structural um, problems, what it means is that we lack international competitiveness in terms of the price, in terms of the quality of the good we have. It could be because of, low quality labor and, you know, capital like machines and all. I think Pakistan is going through this problem, that we've been making textile products for the longest time. We used to be like large exporter. It used to be a big part of our exports. But over the period of time, we did not improve our production capacity. We did not improve our raw material, our machines, our labor. And the other countries like Bangladesh and China and all of those became too competitive. Instead of exporting, we started importing all of these things, at least the raw material and all. So uski wajah se, we haven't been able to succeed. Okay. So now that we have this, ये हमारे पीछे के problems हैं उसके. In this question, we want to assess the likely consequences of domestic and external economies. सही है? So, should you be writing all of these? A country has a persistent deficit on the current account. You may explain this bit, the ऊपर वाला bit, कि current account deficit क्या होता है, just for explanation purposes. उसके बाद hmm, I don't see any reason why you should be explaining these. But अगर तुम briefly करना चाहते हो, you never know कि आज नहीं तो कल they might want it to happen. Let me just see marking scheme. Uh, they want us to explanation of what is meant by current account deficit. It doesn't mention causes. Analysis of the consequences of a persistent deficit on the domestic economy in terms of the other macroeconomic objectives, and then the analysis of this, except answer that refers to the impact on other economies when another economy has a persistent current account deficit, if only the consequences on the domestic or external are considered. Acha ji, by the way, one thing is for sure, that they want क्लैरिटी कि अभी मैं डोमेस्टिक समझा रहा हूं, अभी मैं एक्सटर्नल इम्पैक्ट समझा रहा हूं. ठीक है, दैट क्लैरिटी इज रिक्वायर्ड इन आवर आंसर. तो persistent deficit आ रहा है, we have a continuous deficit, so what should we write? If we have a deficit, and let's assume that our exports minus imports के अंदर this particular number is falling because import ज्यादा है ना, तो the whole exports minus import, yani net exports is falling. I can connect this to, as a result, AD will fall. And when AD falls, price levels will fall, economic growth will fall, unemployment will rise. मैं वहां से इसको connection दे रहा हूं. People's incomes will fall, right? And because incomes are falling, the standard of living of the people is going to fall because they won't be able to afford as much goods and services because unemployment hai. So obviously incomes bhi nahi hai. Overall, persistent deficit अगर हमारे पास आ रहा है, One thing to remember is this is a current account deficit. It's not a balance of payment deficit. Okay. Usually, I think it would not be wrong to say that when we experience deficit in the current account, your balance of payment, we don't have money. So we have to borrow money, and that increases the debts. That increases the debt, और वो भी local debt नहीं होता, it is international debt. इसको मैं पाकिस्तान की केस से अभी तुमको समझा देता हूँ. So international debt increases, so now you owe foreign countries. And as a result, your interest payments rise. तो ये सारे जो है ये sort of like domestic issues हैं हमारे. So ये मैं सारे domestic के point of view से explain करूंगा that this is what is going to happen to my domestic economy. अच्छा, by the way, when you have a deficit also now, I'm just thinking from our another macroeconomic objective, which is exchange rate. Exchange rate इसी में डाल दें. Exchange rate तो external में जाना चाहिए. Yeah, I should not mention that. ओके जी. तो ये हमारी इकोनॉमी के अंदर इशू आ. बाय द वे, ये वाला भी एक्सटर्नल डेट में जा सकता है, लेकिन चलो इसको ऐसे हम प्ले कर लेंगे कि लोकल इकोनॉमी के ऊपर डेट आ जाएगा एंड दैट इज गोइंग टू प्रेशर द लोकल इकोनॉमी. ऑल्दो ये इंटरनेशनल में बिल्कुल जा सकता है, एक्सटर्नल उसके अंदर जा सकता है. बाकी जो मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हैं ये सारे इंटरनल मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हैं. इंटरनेशनल के अंदर आई थिंक, इनफैक्ट, let's just take this one as an international also. This could be our external because eventually इसका impact तो international market में जा रहा है. Also another thing that when our import increases, इसको थोड़ा सा ऐसे समझा सकते हैं हम. When you have a deficit, what is happening is our exports are less and imports are more. So from currency's point of view, our supply for domestic currency is basically greater than the demand for our currency by foreigners. Okay? So as a result, what this does is that it weakens domestic currency. ठीक है? It weakens the domestic currency. And फिर उसकी वजह से, our currency may depreciate. And then you can mention कि how depreciation से जो है, और जो goods हम बाहर से import कर रहे हैं वो हमें expensive पड़ेंगे. And that can bring like cost push inflation and things like that. Like थोड़ा सा ज्यादा leading हो जाएगा. Price of import will rise and cost push inflation may come as a result. So I think that would be a good discussion over here, as long as you're able to make sure that you clarify कि import और exports के अंदर जो है इसका impact discuss किया जाए. ठीक है. uh, I would not be surprised if students answer this particular question in terms of taking these causes, and then in causes they may break it down into external and internal domestic issues. Like, for example, they may choose one of the reasons behind persistent deficit could be that our local economy is growing. And because of that, we are importing a lot of foreign goods and our exports are low, but that may cause our local economy, since our local economy is growing, तो उसकी वजह से जो है हमारी इकोनॉमी के अंदर if AD is increasing, so the prices will rise, and economic growth will happen. Um, लेकिन इसका persistent से ताल्लुक नहीं जा रहा. Persistent का सिर्फ structural से जा रहा है. Um,
Its consequences include positive.
consequences can include positive, sure, why not? It could be both. जैसे यहाँ पे हमने ये price fall का लिखा है. Uh, sure, consequences does not have to be negative. It can be either. Consequences are just the results, so yeah. So it can be good, it can be bad. लेकिन usually persistent deficit sort of suggests that there should be some sort of bad effects. I think यहाँ पे majority जो हमने लिखे हैं वो काफी हद तक bad effects ही हैं because of the persistent. But persistent का मैं ये सोच रहा था कि if your economy is growing या बाहर वाले का जो trading partners की economic activity is down, um, उसकी वजह से जो डेफिसिट आ रहा है दीज आर नॉट द ones that we usually, इवन बैंफर्ड के अंदर इन दोनों को hasn't we haven't considered them as a problematic ones because they self correct itself. Trading partners are going through down economic activity because their economic cycle is probably going down, and they will recover and things will be fine. So that's not much of a worry, you know. बट जब मैं ये persistent का टर्म पढ़ता हूँ ना, तो persistent basically sort of like begs this situation that your imports are continuously more. अब पाकिस्तान का केस देख लो. पाकिस्तान last some decades we have a persistent deficit in our current account, and mainly because of the trade. Primary और उसके अंदर तो we're fine, but trade के अंदर we have a persistent deficit. Now, to buy these imported goods, you need foreign currency, you need dollars. Okay, it's not that you can print rupiah and buy that thing with the rupiah, because international economy के अंदर dollars चलते हैं. So in that case, we'll have to print rupiah, go to the foreign exchange market, supply the rupiah, and that weakens our currency, right? So we don't want to weaken our currency. We want to use the dollars that we have. अब वो डॉलर्स तो हमारे पास एक्सपोर्ट के थ्रू आते हैं. अब if our exports are less and our imports are more, we don't have enough dollars. So that puts a pressure on us to raise the dollars from somewhere. तो हम फिर IMF के पास जाते हैं और इंटरनेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस के पास जाते हैं, कंट्रीज के पास जाते हैं, एंड से कि भाई हमें आप ये पैसे दे दें so that we can buy these imported goods. Okay? And now that we are borrowing money, we have to pay interest on it. And the more debt we have, the more interest we have to pay. अब ये interest payments होंगी कहाँ से? असल issue is this. It's not something that we can take out of our GDP, because GDP तो रुपये के अंदर है. We need dollars to make these interest payments. So every time we export something, we have to, उससे जो डॉलर आते हैं उसका एक chunk gets reserved to make interest payments. Normally, our explanation is this. देखो, if the question is export अच्छा है कि import अच्छा है, we say import अच्छा है if you want to talk in terms of living standards. लेकिन financially it's bad. तो असल में import को finance करने के लिए हमें export करना है. Okay, that's the main agenda for governments to export. That when we import stuff, by exporting, we get those dollars and we can afford to import these goods and services. But if our exports are less and our imports are more, we lack money, we don't have money, and now we have to borrow money. So इसीलिए governments usually क्या करती है? Governments try to encourage foreign investments to come in the country. That's another source of raising dollars in the country. Or you can take loans. Loans पे interest देना पड़ता है. At least foreign direct investments में you have to just give profits, which the companies makes themselves, less burden on the government. तो हम, you know, फॉरेन डायरेक्ट इन्वेस्टमेंट्स को इनकरेज करते हैं टू कम इनटू द कंट्री। ये फाइनेंशियल अकाउंट में रिकॉर्ड होता है बाय द वे, बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट के। बट इट सॉल्व्स आवर प्रॉब्लम। तो दैट्स वेयर यू रेज द मनी। राइट नाउ द प्रॉब्लम इज इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट ड्यू है, और वो इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट्स जो आपने गुड्स एक्सपोर्ट्स किए हैं वहीं से यूज हो सकते हैं, या बाहर से इन्वेस्टमेंट्स आई है वहां से, या फिर इंटरनेशनल डेट्स है, which puts you in a vicious cycle that this interest needs to be paid, right? You can't really postpone it, or at least we don't want to have that discussion that you can roll it over and stuff like that. जैसे अभी यूएई के साथ हुआ, and they asked for their $2-3 billion, and then all of a sudden we had like in our balance of payment we had this alarm ringing that oh my god, what are we going to do? Because 2-3 billion out of 16 billion अगर बाहर चले गए, so what are we supposed to do? IMF is gonna start breathing down our necks. But lucky for us, this time we were in a good place. So Saudi Arab and Qatar, they pledged it, and even USA, we're on good books right now. So they probably said to the IMF to be easy on them. तो उसी के फौरन बाद हमारी जो है इंटरनेशनल एक क्रेडिट रेटिंग एजेंसीज होती हैं, स्टैंडर्ड एंड पुअर के नाम से है, S&P, एंड यू हैव फिच। तो फिच ने जो है वो तो पाकिस्तान को B- का ग्रेड दे दिया है, दैट वी डू सी अ लिटिल प्रॉब्लम इधर उधर, बट दैट वाज जस्ट लाइक द लास्ट पैराग्राफ ऑफ देयर एंटायर आर्टिकल। बट उससे पहले 3-4 पैराग्राफ्स के अंदर दे जस्ट assured the international world that the Pakistanis are in good place. So, let's not create a panic. Let them deal with the whole, uh, this whole war and playing a mediator. But I can assure you कि आज अगर हम इस पोजीशन के ऊपर नहीं होते, and if IMF had asked, sorry, the UAE had asked us for the money, probably our stock market would have been like falling down. Uh, पिच की कोई ज्यादा अच्छी रिपोर्ट नहीं होती हमारे लिए, बिकॉज वी सीन दिस। आप 3-4 साल पीछे चले जाएं, when the political government said no to the bases and all, and we went on the negative side of the books, all of a sudden it did create a panic. So, khair, that's like the whole picture of balance of payment and why balance of payment is such a crucial thing, especially for developing countries. By the way, you know how we've been talking about macroeconomic objectives, like economic growth and price stability and unemployment, how we've always taken these as the top three, and then we say stable balance of payment. Developing countries, like I can assure कि पाकिस्तान के केस के अंदर we've always kept stable balance of payment as the top macroeconomic objective, and then comes the other internal macroeconomic objectives. We've always focused on the external aspect of the balance of payment and current account in comparison to our domestic matters. Why? Because our understanding is because we're a highly import oriented economy, any kind of masla in our balance of payment affects the dollar, and then dollar impacts massively because cost push inflation comes in, and it just creates stagflation in Pakistani economy because we rely heavily on imports. All kinds of economic growth, domestic growth relies on imported raw material and machines and everything for Pakistan. तो हमारे लिए बड़ा प्रॉब्लम हो जाता है. So that's why our first priority is always to stabilize the dollar, because that's much of an issue. तो इस क्वेश्चन के अंदर जब हम दोबारा जाते हैं, based on the analysis we've just done, assess the likely consequences of the domestic and external economy of this country. It's not mentioning कि हमें basically eventually किस चीज के ऊपर evaluate करना है. Like, are we saying domestic is more important than external? I think it's open-ended, so you can go for that discussion. Because यहाँ marking scheme में तो all they're saying is that clearly considers the likely consequence of both parts of the economy and comes to the conclusion as to the most likely consequences. तो ये तो हमने जो बात की है, these are the likely consequences of this whole thing. right? इसमें थोड़ा सा अगर हम persistent को tackle कर लें, that if a country is going through like structural problems and we have a persistent deficit because of the structural problems, then the country's external matters become very important because then our currency weakens and we have a lot of interest payments. So that may become a much more problematic situation for the country. Our local economy does not care about um, you know, um, कि yeah, बल्कि in fact even the local economy relies heavily on our eventually exchange rate and all because उससे आपका export import पे फर्क आता है. But if we are like a very closed economy and we have a deficit and it's a structural one, it's a problematic one, we need to sort it out using the supply side policies. But if it is because of the first reason कि growing economy की वजह से deficit आ रहा है, so it might not be a problem because, our domestic matters are under control. ठीक. But obviously, हमारा external आज नहीं तो कल long run के अंदर it will become problematic for us. So persistent deficit is always a problem. We want to avoid doing that. कभी कभार ये हो जाता है कि if we have a persistent deficit and it is because that a heavy, अगर एक तरीके से हम कह रहे हो कि we are importing like machines and all of these things, raw materials and all, and then we can use these and we can export these things abroad. So then it may not be a problem. कि import आ रहा है, but then we are manufacturing some expensive stuff and selling it abroad. फिर I think फिर कोई इतना issue नहीं होना चाहिए उसके अंदर. ठीक है. All right. So आगे we have more questions on this. Let me just discuss one or two questions more on this. So there was another question. It came in November 23 का मैं discuss कर रहा हूँ, right? Question आया November 24, variant 21. Yeah, it's November question. So all right, let's take a look at this one. All right, let's take a look at this one. It's November 24, variant 21. Let's read the question. Assess whether an economy will always benefit from having a surplus on the current account of its balance of payment. So, a few things about this one. I think we should define a little bit about the surplus in the current account. The inflows are greater than the outflows. Okay, number one. And it can happen. अब surplus की बात हो रही है तो causes को अब आप उल्टा कर दें. Okay, if we have a surplus, what could that mean is that your economy is actually declining, your domestic economy is declining, And when your domestic economy is declining, that means that you're importing less because people don't have money to buy imported stuff and all. So your economy is kind of like suffering. And at the same time, uh, your local producers are exporting goods abroad. तो ये declining के अंदर exports are rising and imports are falling. दूसरा, your trading partners their economy is growing, so they want to buy stuff from your country. So your exports are going up. I'm just making the opposite of the previous essays that we just dealt with. And lastly, it can happen because of your economy is not suffering from structural, issues, and you are phenomenal in that aspect. And because your products are internationally competitive and all, the world wants to buy your product. And because of that, your exports are good and your imports are not so bad, right? So ye us tarah se along that line, we can have this discussion. Okay, ji. Uh, Based on this, obviously we have to write about the good things about surplus. Obviously, there should be plenty of good things about the surplus. तो हम अगर इसको एक्सप्लेन करने जाएं तो आई वुड से थिंग्स लाइक कि अगर in terms of surplus, after just basic definitions above, there are some benefits. Okay. When we have a surplus, our exports are greater than imports, our inflows are greater than our outflows, and number one, that may lead to appreciation of our currency, which may allow the imports to become cheaper and we can get cheaper raw materials and price of exports might rise, which may hurt our exports revenue, but it may benefit us in terms of import. अभी थोड़ा सा अब नेगेटिव साइड पे जाने से पहले मैं इस डिस्कशन को रोक दूंगा. Just in terms of we can get cheaper imports, so living standards will improve and price of exports will rise. इसको मैं यहाँ से connect कर देता हूँ. You remember that terms of trade? The terms of trade will go up. That means एक unit of exports can allow us to buy more units of imports now. So that's a good term of trade, a favorable term of trade for us. ठीक है? Other than that, if obviously our exports are greater, so that means economic growth is going to go up. You know how AD will rise, economic growth will go up, employment is going to rise, people are going to make good incomes, and as a result, their standard of living is going to go up. So, उस point of view, say we could suggest that these are all good things. साथ ही में import बढ़ने की वजह से भी, you remember the standard of living goes up also as a result of that. So these could be some good things about it. ठीक है? Other than that, how surplus could be bad for our economy? You're exporting too much. So from the disadvantage point of view, um, जैसे चाइना का केस उठाते हैं, China has been having like crazy amounts of surpluses over the years that can sort of signify weaker domestic economy या purchasing power. So people do not have the ability to buy these goods, right? So they are consuming less. Their consumer expenditure, domestic consumer expenditure is sort of low. And because of that, we could say that the people's standard of living is not that great. ये चाइना के लिए हम केस कर सकते हैं that even though China exports so much goods and services, turns out the rich is getting richer and the poor is not, the workers are not really getting the chance to consume all those goods that they are exporting. And obviously, उसकी वजह से then you can have a lot of problems, weaker economy के point of view से भी. ठीक है. Uh, और क्या disadvantage हो सकते हैं surpluses के? There are things that we mention about surplus that sometimes what happens is when you have a surplus, you convert those surplus into reserves, foreign currency reserves, which the Chinese does. So उससे क्या हो रहा है that basically by keeping the reserves, you are forgoing imports, current imports, which you could have imported, and that could have improved the standard of living for your people. Um, उसके अलावा जो आपने रिजर्व्स रखे हुए हैं, those reserves could have earned you interest, so there is a loss of interest that could be earned. ओके. सरप्लस के और क्या डिसएडवांटेज दे सकते हैं हम? एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ सरप्लस, करंट अकाउंट अच्छा हो जाता है बिकॉज एक्सपोर्ट्स राइजेस एंड इंपोर्ट्स फॉल हो जाते हैं. आई कांट थिंक ऑफ एनीथिंग एल्स. लेट मी सी मार्किंग स्कीम. अगर कॉजेस से ये लोग कन्वर्ट कर लें तो दैट वुड बी अनदर थिंग दैट कुड बी डिस्कस्ड ओवर हियर, बट लेट्स टेक अ लुक एट इट. ओके, इसके अंदर दे नॉट गिविंग यू मार्क, एटलीस्ट इस मार्किंग स्कीम के अंदर दे नॉट गिविंग यू अ मार्क फॉर surplus or उसकी कोई भी definition or explanation के. They're just directly going into the potential benefits of it. So they are explaining a country will have a surplus foreign exchange which it could use to invest in other countries. Okay, so that's a good advantage. जैसे चाइना करता है बेल्ट इनिशिएटिव, जो उन्होंने पूरा लिया हुआ है, रोड एंड बेल्ट इनिशिएटिव, जो गवादर में इन्वेस्टमेंट्स की हैं, ईस्टर्न यूरोपियन इकोनॉमीज में की हुई हैं, अफ्रीकाज में की हुई हैं. So because they're earning so much money, they can invest that money. So that means they're not converting it into reserves. They're just taking their money and they are investing it abroad. High level of exports की वजह से jobs create होंगी. Export sector will be doing good. Obviously, it's a result of more exports and less imports. Lower spending on import means people are buying more domestic goods. That could be a good advantage, and that could lead to increased employment that can stimulate economic growth. ये वही वाली बात हो गई कि X ज्यादा है, M कम है, तो AD बढ़ रहा है, AD shifts to the right, and then all the positive things come with it. लेकिन इन्फ्लेशन भी हो सकती है. So one of the disadvantage I can write is the disinflation वाला aspect over here. Inflation हो सकती है, demand pull inflation because of rising exports. The current account surplus may be a sign of weak domestic demand with lower consumer spending, and this could reduce domestic employment. Yeah, तो ये तो वही बात हो गई कि आपकी लोकल इकोनॉमी के अंदर ज्यादा, आपकी लोकल इकोनॉमी गरीब है, सिर्फ इंटरनेशनली जो है आपका प्रोडक्ट ज्यादा बिक रहा है, और उसकी वजह से ज्यादातर जो है आपका जो एक्सपोर्टर है, द इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट, दे आर मेकिंग मनी, बट द रेस्ट ऑफ द इकोनॉमी इज नॉट मेकिंग सो मच मनी. दैट्स स्टिल ऑन द पुअरर साइड. Other than that, it could lead to lower economic growth. Uh, how are they connecting? I think ये सारा इसी से कनेक्शन किया हुआ है इन्होंने. Because of the low domestic demand, हो सकता है कि C और I के अंदर ड्रॉप आ जाए, and that can cause AD to fall, and that may cause even recession. Surplus could cause recession in the economy. I think that's where they're making the connection. That this is what's happening. There is this policy. It's called expenditure reducing policy. उसमें क्या होता है? That through contractionary fiscal and monetary, what you're trying to do is slow the aggregate demand. So your domestic producer starts to sell goods abroad. Because your people don't have so much spending, what happens is your AD starts to go down. And that causes your overall economy to slow down. And domestic producers have no choice but to sell the product abroad. For example, आप कहते हैं कि let's do a contractionary fiscal policy. Let's increase the taxes on the people's income and reduce government spending ताकि हम डोमेस्टिक स्पेंडिंग भी कम करें और इंपोर्टेड गुड्स की स्पेंडिंग भी कम करें तो उससे क्या होगा exports तो पता नहीं but imports will definitely fall because people will not have the buying power because we've taxed them. Okay, so people do not have the buying power, so they're not buying imported goods, and your domestic producers have no choice but to start exporting the goods abroad. Okay, तो इससे क्या हुआ exports rose, import fell, your current account problem solved, surplus. Lekin, when you look into the country, you realize by taxing people, we've actually taken away their ability to consume. C went down, I went down, G went down. So as a result, the entire economy, ka jo local economy, hai, the AD fell down. And that AD falling down ended up creating a recession in the economy, falling economic growth. One good thing out of it that inflation might get under control. बट ये उस पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से ये सरप्लस का काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट है. It can contribute to lower output and employment in those countries with a current account deficit. Another thing, this policy, which I'm just talking about, in an open economy, if an economy is like, like Maldives, it's a very open economy, Mauritius, open economy, relies heavily on tourism. उसमें export और import के numbers are big. So you want the exports ke numbers to go up and import ke numbers to fall down and achieve a surplus. Your entire AD does not get affected so badly. But if you're not a very large economy, most of your consumption comes low, most of your demand comes from an internal economy. तो उस economy के अंदर you're actually going to create much bigger macroeconomic issues than your external issues. So ये closed और open का discussion यहाँ हो सकता है. Consider the possible benefits and disadvantages of a surplus. Consider the size of the surplus and the possible reasons for it. ये evaluation के अंदर बात हो रही है. Okay, if you have a small surplus, that's not bad because what you can do with a small surplus is future cyclical deficits को you can tackle with that. किस तरह से? That, country like Thailand, surplus in tourism times and agriculture time, deficit in non-tourism, non-agriculture time. So if you know कि आपका छोटा सा surplus आ गया है because of that season, so you can use that for future deficits, future investment, right? So it's a good thing to have a small surplus. If you have a large surplus, then you can undertake large capital intensive investments. Okay, and you can import heavy machinery कि आप जाके रिकोडिक के अंदर से गोल्ड और कॉपर माइनिंग कर सकें with those heavy expensive machines. So you can finance that. You can finance international investments. तो छोटे साइज छोटे मसले सॉल्व करने में आ सकते हैं. The cyclicals one. बड़ा surplus can be used for large investments. लेकिन remember at the same time, if you have very large deficits, the problem with those large surpluses, sorry, is that that money might be just sitting in your vaults and not being used to import stuff. And as a result, your local economy suffers in terms of goods and services. And there's an opportunity cost because with the rising inflation, आपके जो reserves हैं वो भी अपनी value lose करना शुरू कर देते हैं. तो along this line, you can have this discussion because eventually, क्या conclusion के अंदर is a surplus always beneficial? Well, अगर ये question deficit का होता तो deficit is not always preferred. Surpluses still have more goods than bads. at least from the external point of view, right? Any questions on this?